In the forest's heart, an alabaster effigy stood sentinel, a pale face staring sternly despite the erosion claiming its complexities. The fine fissures wrinkling its once smooth visage erased its sneer of cold command, and gave it a new expression, one wrought with worry and woe. Its lopsided pedestal was cracking, leaning precariously where the soil supporting it had finally given out. Nevertheless, the winged figure stood tall and scanned the canopy, a green sea that rolled on to the horizon. He was carven in the image of the King of Kings, erected to protect the citadel sprawling beneath it. Though this figure's makers were long gone and all but forgotten, he would continue his watch until the elements scoured his eyes away, until his 8-sided tower toppled, leaving naught but 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone, until he fell face first into the green bosom of Mother Nirn, until he was helplessly blind to the ongoing decay of his maker's civilization. Bara Ajaya Rai Sukaran, wear law as your armour. Before Talos breathed in royalty and the Heartland was reshaped, Cyrodiil had been jungled. Its tropical climb had not been welcoming to the southern Mer who first colonised it. They were more accustomed to merry weather, to tranquil pastures and blooms of flushed fuchsia and crisp cornflower, bathed in Magnus's dazzling trail. The Heartland was no place for the shaping hands of civilised folk. The jungles shaped themselves, and inhabitants of the region would be wise to take that fact with humility. Humility, though, was the bane of the High Elves and their grand designs, for architecture was the most enlightened art and a means of climbing to the highest heights, where Auriel the eagle soars and Magnus beams magnificently. They had come after the reports of Topal the Pilot, a poet and explorer of great renown among the Oldmer. He had lived in the Middle Merethic era and had sailed in search of the ancient Aldmeri homeland of Aldmeris. But his ship, the Niben, had failed to find this mythic place, and instead stumbled upon Tamriel. While charting the continent's perimeter, the Niben had strayed off course, and wound the waterways of the ship's eponymous river. As they traversed the Niben River's meandering arteries, plunging deeper into the heart of Dawn's beauty, Topal and his crew encountered a most remarkable phenomenon. The river opened onto a vast azure lake, with 8 islets huddled at its centre. Inhabiting those islands was an intelligent species of beast folk. Not reptilian, not feline, but avian. An excerpt from the 4th fragment of Topal's journal, as translated in the text Father of the Niben reads: "The cat demons of 4 legs and 2 ran the river's length, always keeping the boat in their green-eyed sight, hissing and spitting and roaring with rage. But the sailors never had to brave the shores, for fruit trees welcomed them, dropping their arms down to the river's edge as if to embrace the Mer, and the men took the fruit quickly before the cats could pounce. For 11 days they travelled north, until they came to a crystalline lake, and 8 islands of surpassing beauty and peace. Brilliant flightful creatures of glorious colours greeted them in Aldmeri language, making the Mer wonder, until they understood they were only calling back the word they were speaking without understanding it, and then the sailors laughed. Topal the Pilot was enchanted with the islands and the feathered men who lived there. There the Niben stayed for a moon, and the birdmen learned how to speak their own words, and with taloned feet to write. In joy for their new knowledge, they made Topal their lord, giving him their islands for the gift. Topal said he would return someday, but first he must find the passage east to Firsthold, so far away. Topal never returned to those 8 islands in the centre of what is now known as Lake Romer, nor did he ever see those fantastic flightful creatures again. No living soul knows what happened to the birdmen. Topal's translator suggests the cat demons caught them, a reasonable assumption given the observed relationship between common cats and birds. But there is evidence to suggest that Topal's descendants did encounter them again, and given the enthusiasm of the birdfolk upon meeting the Oldmer sailors, you can imagine how elated they must have felt when the first Ayleids arrived soon later, still in the Middle Malefic era. The Ayleids we know have their own unique identity, separate from their Old Mary forebears. But at the time, they would have been just like Topal and his men, just like the other Aldmer, and this shaped their perception of the birdfolk of the Eight Isles. You see, back in Summerset, or Alinor as it was called before Imperialization, the High Elves venerated a pantheon led by Auriel. As immortalized in the monomyth, the High Elves believe that the original spirits, the ancestors of elf kind, were trapped in the Mundus by tricky Lorkhan. Auriel had pleaded with Anu to take them back to Aetherius, but it was far too late. Mundus was the house of Sithis, and chaos filled every corner. As punishment for his trick, Auriel commanded his greatest knight Trinomac to rend the heart from Lorkhan's chest. But the Golden One had erred, for the removal of the divine spark only solidified their downfall. Stripped of imagination, the original spirits deteriorated, becoming Elnafey. Then all was as hazy and grey as the grey may be. In their weakness, gods became mortal, Etada became Aldmer, and those amnesiac Aldmer yearned for what was lost. They tried to retrace their steps back to the divine, but found only dead ends. Topal was one of the elves tasked with restoring the Aldmer to their former glory, with adding resplendent Aldmeris to their maps. But Aldmeris existed only in their collective imagination. It was a memory of a time before Magicka coalesced into creation. According to the 3rd edition of the Pocket Guide, ancient texts and tapestries portray Aldmeris as a beautiful but very strange land. In no representation of Aldmeris are there any trees or life but the Aldmer themselves. It appears always as an endless city, built upon itself over and over again, until no nature remains at all. Like memories, each new layer of the endless city suffocates the last. Nothing is tangible, all is conceptual. When the Aldmer finally lost hope of finding their ancestral homeland, they instead endeavoured to transform their current homeland, which was in truth always their homeland, into a realm worthy of the gods. In the capital city of Alinor, the High Elves took solace in the pursuit of their most prestigious creative art, architecture. As illustrated in the 1st edition of the Pocket Guide to the Empire, Alinor seemed to be made from glass or insect wings. The city was straight and glimmering, a hypnotic swirl of ramparts and impossibly high towers, designed to catch the light of the sun and break it to its component colours, which lies draped across its stones until you are thankful for nightfall. And while the Ultima may be misguided in their belief that their marvellous creations would carry them to Aetherius, there was no denying the beatific beauty of their architecture. It was a noble pursuit. They were not mistaken in believing there was magic in the sky above. Magnus and the Magnagi were permanent reminders of that. And so, when the Ayleids made their way along the winding waterways of the Niben, and came upon the flightful creatures of Topal's poems, they were enraptured. They rejoiced, for the birdfolk were capable of coming closer than any other to reaching Magnus and Aetherius. They soared effortlessly above the highest Altmeri towers, without laying a single stone or glazing a single window. Topal's translator, Florin Jalil, suggests that the absence of these flightful creatures from the rest of Tamrielic history likely came down to their proximity to the snarling cat demons occupying the shores of the river. But one look at how Ayleid culture diverged from Ultima culture dissipates that theory. Elven armour across Tamriel features a lot of avian imagery, from the feather patterns on the greaves to taloned sabatons and winged helms. These bird-like motifs are largely due to Auriel's depiction as an eagle, but the Ayleids take it even further. The Song of Pelinal, which is part myth, part history, tells of feathers and beads, of arrowheads made from bird beaks, and even hints that some of their kings might have in fact been avian in physiology. Here are some excerpts from Volume 2. And Pelinal came to Perif's camp of rebels holding a sword and mace, both encrusted with the smashed viscera of elven faces. Feathers and magic beads, which were the markings of the Ayleidoun, stuck to the redness that hung from his weapons. From Volume 3, when Huna, whom Pelinal raised from grain slave to hoplite and loved well, took death from an arrowhead made from the beak of Pelinal the singer, the White Strake went on his first madness. And from Volume 4, the ball had fallen to a volley of bird beaks. Of course, there is also the legendary Umaril the Unfeathered, but we'll come to the Song of Pelinal and the fall of the Ayleids later on in the video. It seems almost certain then that the Ayleids had found the birdfolk upon their migration to the Heartland. It's impossible to say what relationship was shared between the settling elves and the native bird people, but what we do know is that the latter race soon ceased to be. Were they enslaved? Were they systematically wiped out? Were they assimilated into Ayleid culture? The Ayleids most certainly developed a reputation for cruelty later in their history, but at this time, I truly believe they would have seen the natives as creatures that represented Auriel's majesty. Of course, as beasts, they were lesser than elves, who could trace their lineage directly back to the king of the Aldmer, but that does not necessarily mean the Ayleids would have subjugated them. One Imperial guard in Leyawiin named Decentius Opsius had this to say on the topic.
He purchased the 8 islands, the site of White Gold Tower and the Imperial City, from the Beastfolk natives for the secret of literacy. Pretty soon, the Beastfolk all knew how to read and write, which was handy, since it made them better slaves for the Ayleids.
Whether you agree or not, this is only gossip. Another source, the text titled Glories and Laments, seemingly references the birdfolk too, stating, their deadly traps and mechanisms, did not secure the Ayleids against their true enemies, which were not the slaves who revolted and overthrew their cruel masters, nor were they the savage beast peoples who learned the crafts of war and magic from their Ayleid masters. The author does not group the beast peoples with the Nedic slaves, and mentions them separately. He also suggests that the Ayleids taught them about war and magic. Perhaps the Ayleids incorporated the birdfolk into their culture, creating a hybrid that allowed them to diverge dramatically from traditional Ultima culture. This would be in keeping with the initial relationship between Topal the pilot and the birdfolk too. Topal and his Mer had stayed for a moon, teaching them to speak and write, and the birds had honoured him with the title of Lord, giving him their isles as a gift. The newly arrived elves would have needed help from the locals adjusting to the tropical climate, learning to live in the jungle, to hunt and survive. And in return, the elves could share their lore and language and technology. Pelinal the singer, mentioned in the Song of Pelinal, sounds like the name of an Ayleid king, and the song claims that Pelinal had a beak. We'll come to the sins of the Ayleids in due time, but I believe it would be foolish to paint every action of this once glorious race as malicious. I believe their cultures were integrated to mutual benefit. I believe the birdfolk went extinct for the same reason that the Ayleid Empire went extinct, and that reason is a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves and beasts. Vabria Frenska, Sabel, Saborn, Amaral Dane, Aldmeris Adonai. The foaming wave, so thunderous, so mighty, heralds the lordly elves. The reason this splinter group left Summerset initially isn't explicitly stated. It is quite possible they were exiled for unorthodox worship, or left willingly to create their own rules regarding worship. There is an Ayleid phrase suggesting exile. It goes as follows. Nu Aldmeris Mafmeldi Admia Oran Gandra Sepredia Av Relais Ye Breliais Ye Vale. Our exiled elven ancestors heard the welcoming gifts of peace in the streams and beech trees and stars. Mafmeldi means literally from home driven. The most obvious reason the Ayleids would have been exiled from Alinor is their willingness to venerate Daedra. But that doesn't necessarily mean Daedra worship was rampant from the beginning. There were other major elven diasporas in the Middle Merethic era too, like those of the Kaima and Orsama. The Aldmer of the Merethic times were notoriously strict about upholding the worship of gods like Auriel and Trinimac, while denouncing worship of gods like Boethiah and Mephala. History seems to suggest that the prevalence of Daedra worship among the Ayleids grew slowly, the insidious nature of it taking centuries to manifest. We'll talk more on that soon, for it's fundamental in their undoing. In the rich, fertile heartland of Dawn's beauty, the Ayleids flourished. A humble exodus burgeoned into a mighty empire, and in order to erect something everlasting, the elves needed labourers. As we've already discussed, it's unclear whether the Ayleids subjugated the birdfolk, but one thing is perfectly clear, and that's that the Nedic human population of the region were perfect candidates. The needs of the Heartland are often referred to as Proto-Cyrodiilians, and at this time in history, they were a rudimentary people. The elves of the Malefic era were far more advanced than the humans in Tamriel, hence the name Malefic, which is a Nordic word meaning era of the elves. At this time, the Nords were still in Atmora, and the earlier Nedic migrations from the north could not fight back against the elves. The Direnni opted to coexist with the needs of High Rock, keeping them as second-class citizens of course. But the Ayleids were not so magnanimous. The Direnni might have been satisfied with their fragile hegemony, but the Ayleids had far greater ambitions, and the needs were a resource to be exploited. With unlimited free labour and a drive to turn the savage, starry heart of Nirn into the new hub of elven civilization, the Ayleids commenced the construction of the cities that would comprise their vast empire. Above the ground, columns of perfectly cut stone outgrew the tallest surrounding trees. Archways like portals to Aetherius served as spectacular flourishes over raised walkways, demonstrating the singular skill of their masons. These craftsmen were not daunted by arcs and curves, embracing them to dazzling effect. Intricate tangles of metalwork adorn those archways like golden gossamer, and as a spiderweb expands from a central hub, these walkways converge upon meticulously carved statues of their gods, upon wells of starlight, and upon the entrances to the subterranean reaches. Beneath Nirn's epidermis, Ayleid architecture was equally ambitious. Here is one explorer, named Alexander Hatrard's description of the ancient city of Seatartar. Within the forest tangle I discovered an entrance leading down into the central dome of a great underground edifice, once dedicated to Magnus, the god of sight, light, and insight. Dimly lit by the faded power of its magical pools, the shattered white walls of the enclosure shimmered with a cold blue light. The marble benches of the central plaza faced out across the surrounding waters to tall columns and sharp arches supporting the high dome. From the central island, stately bridges span the pools to narrow walkways behind the columns, with broad vaulted avenues and limpid canals leading away through ever-deepening gloom into darkness. Reflected in the pools were the tumbled columns, collapsed walls, and riotous root and vine growth thriving in the dark half-light of the magical fountains. The Ayleids considered fire to be a tool of primitive folk. It had given them life, once, but night was the source of light that would bring them to royal splendour. Thus, they cared only for the light that beamed down from Aetherius upon high. That energy connected them to their ancestors. Sun and starlight were therefore sacred to the Ayleids. In fact, the same explorer, in the text Glories and Laments, explains that the ancient Ayleids recognised not the four elements of modern natural philosophy, earth, water, air and fire, but the four elements of high elf religion, earth, water, air and light. The Ayleids considered fire to be but a weak and corrupt form of light, which Ayleid philosophers identified with primary magical principles. Thus, their ancient subterranean temples and sanctuaries were lit by lamps, globes, pools, and fountains of purest magic. While these underground expanses were incredibly well designed, why would such a pious race, so reverent to Magnus the great Orbic architect, choose to build the bulk of their empire below the earth, where those very sources of divine light cannot reach? Caving was generally reserved for the dwarves, who had no love for the self-aggrandizing original spirits. Well, no, I wasn't saying well as a way to lead into the answer. Well is the answer. The Ayleids created wells, not to pull water from Nirn's body, but to catch the light of the Magna Gi, and they achieved this feat with the ethereal debris that sporadically rained down upon their starry heart of Cyrodiil. Meteoric glass, iron, and other ethereal fragments jettisoned from the immortal plane, and the Ayleids worked these resources to construct receptacles capable of capturing and harnessing the power of starlight. They would then cut meteoric glass into Vala and Welkin stones that could contain and channel that starlight. Vala translates to starstone, while Welkind literally means child of the sky. One scholar, named Erlav Jorel, wrote a treatise in an effort to decipher the significance of Ayleid wells, Vala and Welkin stones. He noted that these wells were not only designed to capture starlight, but also to radiate magical power back into the sky, which prompts some to theorize they are also objects with religious or magical ritual significance, perhaps a means of offering magic back to the heavens. The potential of this focused power was astronomical, and none but the Ayleids had discovered it. Just imagine what kind of magic or information they were trying to send back to Aetherius, almost like probing space with a satellite. This same power was used to bring light to the farthest reaches beneath Nirn, illuminating their temples and fountains, and spreading the power of Aetherius beneath the ground. But that was only the beginning. Av Molag and Yamis, Avlata Magica. From fire, life. From light, magic. The Ayleids soon discovered that casting light and spells was only a small part of what starlight made possible. When focused into a Welkind or Vala stone, starlight allowed the Ayleids to not only restore their reserves of magicka, but even preserve their memories. Tragically, there is so little surviving evidence of this, with the only solid sources being an ancient Barsebic diadem and a passing comment from a Daedric prince. The crown's description reads, "The Ayleids sometimes used Vala or Starstone to preserve memories," and Hermaeus Mora, when speaking to the vestige, says that Ayleid crystals impart memories directly to the reader. Overuse leads to a problem of capacity for most mortals. The Ayleid Empire long predates the heroes of modern times. In the late Malefic, early First Eras, all the information we really have to draw from is in the form of myths, or the recordings of Isgramor, the first human historian. But the Nords would not interact with the Ayleids until the coda of their empire. It is a crying shame. Crystals that could preserve memories. Crystals that exceeded the mortal mind for capacity. The only existing artifacts in Tamriel that share these characteristics are the memory stones of the Akudans. It is said that these stones could record and project the memories of the possessor, immortalized outside of the flesh. But these stones came to Tamriel from Lost Yakuda, and there is no surviving knowledge on what they are or how to find more of them. It's startling to think that thousands of years before the heroes of our contemporary Tamrielic stories, there were technologies that remain unparalleled to the modern day, their potential unrealized. Erlach Jural in his writings ponders, Ayleid wells, Welkin stones, Vala stones. Consider then these marvels of magical enchantment. Are we then to conclude that the Ayleids were a superior race and culture? Did they so exceed us in art and craft that they mock the feeble powers of Third Era wizards? The Ayleids, in their genius, had discovered this profound magical technology, but they had not endured long enough to truly harness it. Had the Ayleids approached this budding technology with the same enthusiasm that they had for their architecture, there's no knowing what they might have achieved. Its potential was never realized, but their wells did play a major part in the history of the Ayleid Empire and in their downfall. Suna ye Suna Bay, bless and blessed be. At this point I must address, the timeline of the Dawn and Malefic eras is anything but reliable. As the gods were emancipated from the divine spark, the mortal realm became the house of Sithis, of limitation, and chaos reigned. It is believed that the dawn ends when Lorkhan's heart, his spark, is ripped from his chest by Trinomac, and Auriel affixes it to an arrow, sending it in an arc over Tamriel. But I cannot say how long such a monumental journey would take. Lorkhan's heart must have landed in time for the Dwemer to find it, and make Vardenfell their seat of power, and for the Chimer houses to discover its hidden power. But the journey must also have taken some time, for during its course across the cosmos, the Ayleids had built their first wells, and one of these wells had captured a drop of divinity directly from the soaring heart. Kimel Adabal, a ballad, goes as follows. When Akatosh slew Lorkhan, he ripped his heart right out, hurled it across Tamriel, and the heart was heard to shout, red diamond, the heart and soul of men. Red diamond, protect us till the end. The laughing heart sprayed blood afar, a gout on Cyrodiil fell, and like a dart shot to its mark, down in an Ayleid well. Magic fused the Lorkhan blood to crystal red and strong, then wild elves cut and polished it down to Kim-El Adabal. When the Ayleids discovered the Kim-El Adabal, the red diamond, they must have been exuberant. Such an incandescent gem, it shone so bright it could well have been one of Magnus's own eyes. With this relic in their possession, it was time to construct the magnum opus of the Ayleids. Thanks to the abundance of weak souls to enslave, incredible feats of architecture were able to emerge all across the Heartland. With so many seats worthy of royalty, the Ayleids established an alliance of kingdoms, all unified under one empire. Of course, the heart of this Heartland Empire needed to be the most marvellous of all, and so, upon the centremost of the 8 central isles, the Ayleids built their crowning architectural glory. Rumours of Clan Direnni discovering Adamantia, Tower Zero, in the northwest, reached the Ayleids, and doubtless many made the pilgrimage to witness it with their own eyes. It was the single most wondrous landmark in all of Dawn's beauty. In the words of the historian Beradalmo the Signifier, a member of Clan Direnni, the spike of Adamantia and its zero stone dictated the structure of reality in its orbic vicinity, defining for the Earthbones their story or nature within the unfolding of the dragon's time-bound tale. The old Meri or Malefic elves were singular of purpose, only so long as it took them to realise that other towers, with their own stones, could tell different stories. Thus did the Ayleids commence their own story by constructing a tower on the largest of their 8 isles, a glorious monument for a glorious empire. They constructed it in emulation of Adamantia and called it White Gold, the Temple of the Ancestors. Beradalmo, however, was not enamoured of this incredible feat of elven architecture. The adamantine tower was constructed by the gods. For mortals to imitate it was a brazen kind of blasphemy. He writes, "Of all the prismatic Mer, none were more presumptuous than the Ayleids of the Heartland. They built their tower in open emulation of Adamantia, using as founding stone the great red diamond they had uncovered, Kim-El Adabal, said to be the crystallized blood from the heart of Lorkhan itself. For the heart on its arrow passed over the Heartlands, birthing one of that post-Nimic's quaternary meanings. Thus did White Gold become Tower 1, as all know. But the Ayleids had left Summerset to avoid that exact kind of pious limitation that yoked the High Elves. They took pride in their architecture, and that fact is clear not only from the White Gold Tower, but from all their cities, above and below Nirn's surface. They built their temple in emulation of Adamantia, and while the latter is inimitable, the result was still incredible. And what's more, its foundation stone was an artifact composed of a god's blood, lending a transcendent power that allowed it to rival the resplendence of Adamantia. If Direnni Elves like Beradalmo disliked the Ayleids for constructing this tower, then their disapproval must have been doubled by the fact the founding stone was an artifact of Lorkhan, the very god who had trapped the elves in this forsaken realm. He was an aspect of Sithis, of limitation. He might have been Daedric according to the arbitrary distinction, but other than that, he was Daedric through and through. Daedric or Daedric, it mattered little to the Ayleids. They were building an empire to be seen from the heavens, and the stars showed their appreciation by raining magicka down upon them, like flower petals showering an arena champion. This attitude prevailed as their unique culture and customs continued to set them apart from their former kin. Vagala Sagia, Gravia Yegoria, Latia Malari Av Malatu, In the caverns of lore, ugly and obscure, shines the gold of truth. With the power of harnessed starlight, the Ayleids strive to innovate. It is believed their mages and scholars discovered the spells that would comprise the Alteration School of Magic. In fact, there is a tale of the invention of levitation and water-breathing magic that will come up later in the video. But they found innovative inspiration from other sources too, sources far too profane for their Direnni and Altmeri cousins. And this is where we see the involvement with the Daedra lords proliferate across the empire. Which princes were venerated varied from kingdom to kingdom, citadel to citadel. According to Phrastus of Elenir, a Nibonese historian in the mid-Second Era, as Ayleid culture flourished, drawing ever further from Alinor, in the last millennium of the Malefic Era, Daedric worship took hold and spread among the Heartland High Elves. The Daedra were still widely revered, with probably a majority of the Ayleids continuing to pay them homage, but cults devoted to the various Daedric Princes sprang up across Cyrodiil, tolerated and then celebrated. Unlike the Chimera, the Ayleids made no distinction between good and bad Daedra. Indeed, even some of the more heinous princes received mass veneration, especially when their worship was adopted and endorsed by Ayleid kings and aristocrats. It does make sense to revere some of the demon lords. Daedra worship does not inherently lead to collapsing civilizations. Take the Dunmer and the Khajiit. Before their hides turned dun, the Chimera followed Boethiah, Azura and Mephala to their new homeland of Resdain. These good Daedra taught the Changed Ones some crucial lessons that brought about a golden age called High Velothi culture. The text titled The Changed Ones states, "One day, Boethiah, prince of plots, precocious youth, tricked Trinimac to go into his mouth. Boethiah talked like Trinimac for a while then, and gathered enough people to listen to him. Boethiah showed them the lies of the Atada, the Daedra, and told them Trinimac was the biggest liar of all, saying all this with Trinimac's voice. Boethiah told the mass before him the triangled truth. He showed them, with Mephala, the rules of Psijic endeavour. He taught them how to build houses, and what items they needed to bury in the corners. He demonstrated the right way to wear their skin. He performed the way to walk to achieve an exodus. Then, Boethiah relieved himself of Trinimac right there on the ground before them, to prove all the things he said were the truth. It was easy then for his new people to become the Changed Ones. For reasons we'll discuss in detail in a future video, Boethiah's worldview was heavily influenced by his love for Lorkhan. That is why she showed the Chimera the rules of Psijic endeavour, a means of facing the challenges of the mortal realm without succumbing to self-pity and ultimately atrophy. In a similar vein, the Khajiit do not draw distinctions between Daedric and Daedric deities. Their purposes are measured independently. This can lead to cats straying from the moon path, should they devote themselves too much to gods like Sanguine or Sheogorath. So, I'll re-emphasise, the Ayleids dabbling in the darker spheres of worship was not their death knell, but for such an ambitious culture, they were flirting with disaster. At least one citadel, named Biznensil, was devoted to Hermaeus Mora, Prince of Forbidden Knowledge. The only evidence of Mora worship dates to a time centuries after the Alessian Rebellion. But it's not too far-fetched to assume that such a magically gifted, advanced race would seek out the Patriarch of Secrets. According to one of Hermaeus Mora's Dremora servants, the Ayleids of Biznensil had stored forbidden knowledge of the natural order, which could allow one to manipulate the very fabric of reality on this plane. Yet another example of the unrealised potential of the Ayleid Empire. Another shining city, named Eriki, was ruled by the princess Anarame. The tale Tears of Anarame claims she was the envy of all the Ayleid nobility, for her beauty, grace, and wisdom were unsurpassed. She was swiftly married to the prince of a neighbouring city, and they fell deeply in politically advantageous love with each other. But her prince was often away. Such is the duty of the aristocracy. Anarame stewed with dissatisfaction, and made a concubine of one of her city's young champions. Her affair was eventually exposed, and the two cities clashed in a war fueled by scorn and jealousy. Somehow, Anarame's lover, who had sworn to lead the vanguard of her honour, defected to her husband's side. Did he care only for coin, for opportunity, or had he been a test set by her husband all along? Anarame did not know. All she knew was that she was loveless, and though the battle raged on, she had nothing left to fight for. Embarrassed, enraged, Anarame retreated to the depths of her citadel. She called upon Mephala, the prince of sex, of deception, of ignoble urges, and the web-spinner took pity on her. Mephala bade Anarame pour every tear she had shed over lover and husband into a basin. The spider imbued these tears with the raw power of that kind of hatred that only exists in love, and the result was a delicate yet potent artifact called the Tear of Anarame. The princess took her tear to the highest tower of her city, to the top of the Doomcrag, and unleashed its contemptuous power upon the battlefield below. Both armies, her city, and even her own self were vanquished in the blink of an eye. All that remains of Eriki, and of Anarame herself, is a ruined crypt, but there have been whispers throughout the ages that the tear was not destroyed, and that it's waiting in the rubble, still to be found. Just another dormant Ayleid relic, its potential unrealized after thousands of years. Historians have looked upon the ruins of Eriki in awe, at the remnants of its Doomcrag, and wondered if only the spurned princess had not wiped its memory from Nirn. A Nordic skald named Morakelis hag-husband speculated on the nature of the destroyed Doomcrag, and the recurring character, Thrastus of Elenhir, documented it, stating, Morakelis speculated that the Ayleids who built the Great Spire above Eriki were attempting to create a metaphysical structure that would be a focus of orbic power, much as the Adamantine Tower is said to be. If true, it's possible that the Ayleids were not satisfied having only one orbic tower, and the individual kingdoms might have wished to construct their own, to tell their own stories. Maybe her tear could have been the founding stone. Alas, whether it was Mephala's doing or Anarame's, the Tower of Eriki was toppled by the princess's tears. And this would not even be the most prominent example of an Ayleid ruler attempting to construct a new tower. But more on that later. As we're beginning to discover, Ayleid involvement with the Daedric Princes was starting to undermine the growth of their great empire. And the princes we have yet to discuss took this to another level. But before we speak on those, I'd like to address some curiosities regarding their forgotten gods. Gods that were worshipped by the Ayleids, but never appeared in other Tamrielic pantheons. In a text titled The Adabala, that will have great significance soon, the demigod Manbal Morahouse documents the following. The Ayleids herded in men from across all the Niben, Khofri, Need, Algemha, men of Creth, though these were later known to be imported from the north. Keptu, men of Gi, who were eventually destroyed when the Flower King Nilakai made great sacrifice to an insect god named Lost. Now, out of context, this is quite the quote. The names of these Nedic tribes are fascinating, and each come with their own implications. But that can wait. Who was this insect god the Flower King venerated? Could it have been Mephala the spider? How about Namira? When she's not being associated with the Great Darkness, the Heartland folk are usually associating her with decay, with rot, with slugs and maggots, and creatures that inspire revulsion in mortals. The insect could just as easily be some deity we simply have no concept of, just as the Thalma worshipped Srib, just as the heretics worshipped Gyub. This god, and countless others, might have neglected to make their presence known to mortals, or might have had their presence wiped from the histories. The latter isn't unprecedented, as we'll talk about later in the video, and especially in the next video. Perhaps the most influential of all the princes to the Ayleids is none other than Meridnunda, the Lady of Light. This culture was so enamoured with the twinkling ocean of night above that they would have been better served with bird necks, ever crooked and stargazing. Like their Altmeri kin, they were intrigued by Magnus's flight, and every radiant rift in the firmament told the blazing tales of his children. Oh, what wonders every last light in the blackness held. It's no small wonder then that the Ayleids rejoiced to discover that one of those stars diverged from Magnus's divine trail, forging its own path across the sky. Her story shares many parallels with the Heartland Elves, for they too were like shooting stars, breaking free from Summerset, soaring toward the starry heart of Nirn. Our friend Phrastus of Ellen here contributed a fascinating piece of research to the annals of history when he analysed the translated fragments of a rare manuscript titled The Tract of Meridnunda. It is a work of mytho-history dated to the early First Era, and it was written in a strange hybrid of Ayleidoun with Nedic syntax. Nevertheless, thanks to the efforts of Phrastus, as well as Venegrus Monhana and Herminia Cinna, we can glean some of the Ayleid lore regarding Meridnunda's emancipation. Here are some scattered excerpts. Were known as the 9 coruscations, who followed the parabolas that led away from Magnus. Meridnunda was of these sisters, as was Nemo Li, as was Zero Lig. Thus we call upon Senedelin to bind the earth, as we speak to Meridnunda regarding the light, for she is the scintilla that fears not darkness, and swims the waves of pull and spin. The lords of the Chaos Realms chided Meridnunda for her trespass, and bade her return to Orbis, claiming all existing spheres as their own. But Meridnunda formed of her substance a great drag lens, and the light of Magnus was bent thereby. The rays carved focused a new sphere from the chaos, which Meridnunda, laughing, sparkling, did claim for her own. Thus does Meridnunda slide across the rainbow road from end to end, at one end stretching the dragon, at the other end compressing him. Meridia, or Meridnunda as the Ayleids referred to her, was almost certainly the most widely worshipped prince in the Heartland, and after interpreting the tract, it's no surprise. We speak to Meridnunda regarding the light, for she is the scintilla that fears not darkness, and swims the waves of pull and spin. To the Ayleids, she was the deific embodiment of their most precious element. In his commentary, Phrastus writes, "For the Ayleids, of course, light was one of the 4 elements of creation, and this passage seems to confirm that Meridia was the personification of light to the Wild Elves." The latter part of that tract excerpt eludes Phrastus, and it could well have a more profound meaning than I realise. But my 2 septims is that Meridia fears not darkness because she was willing to refract away from the intoxicating brightness of Aetherius, to blaze a trail into the Chaos Realms. She skimmed along the waters of oblivion, surfing the waves of pull and spin in search of a place to create her coloured rooms. If light is your most precious element, and straying from the traditional trajectory of Anuic elven society is at the core of your culture, then how could the Ayleids not see themselves in the mirrored facets of the Bright Lady? The Aldmer disapproved of diasporas, seeking a unified culture on Summerset, and the Direnni, at least Beradolmo, considered the White Gold Tower a sacrilegious project. The Ayleids were no strangers to being admonished for their ambitions, and once again they shared this with Meridnunda, who was chided for her trespass into the Chaos Realms. And I'm sure if Magnus could reach her in oblivion, he would punish her too. But Meridia was unfazed. She formed of her substance a great drag lens. She bent the light of Magnus. She stretched and compressed Auriel. She made many enemies, but in her audacity she shone. Yes, some would call her the Glister Witch, the Shining Bitch, but not even her staunchest detractors denied her incandescence. And speaking of enemies, perhaps the greatest was Molag Bal, her lover and nemesis. The tract of Meridnunda mentions Senedelin, and he was the king of Deladil, a city devoted to Meridia that once clashed with a rival city devoted to Baal, Abigalis. This is the ancient legend of these 2 Ayleid cities, a legend known as the Withering of Deladil, and it really shows how different the Ayleid kingdoms of the Heartland truly were. Any notion that they were a hive mind, all equally culpable for the crimes of the Empire, is ridiculous. The legend also shows the magical capacity of these elves, with feats that skirt the line between history and mythology. There was, in those days, a city in the Heartland, Cyrodiil by name, and it was a city of pleasant promenades, of learned scholars, of meticulous artisans, and of lissom dancers. And also did Cyrodiil have warriors fierce and proud, who protected the promenades, and the scholars and the artisans and the dancers. And though the warriors were few, they were bold. Now the people of Cyrodiil worshipped many gods, for they were devout and held all the divines in reverence. But above all others they did venerate the Lady of Light, building for Meridia a chapel of coloured rays and beams, which was for glory like a piece of Aetherius brought down to the mortal world. And the people of Cyrodiil were proud thereon. But across the valley was another city, Abergalus, which was to the darkness as Cyrodiil was to the light. Now, Abergalus had as many citizens as Cyrodiil, but few were dancers, artisans and scholars, because most were warriors fierce and proud. These warriors were lent to other states and cities for the making of war in return for wealth. And thus did Abergalus, in its own way, prosper. In theory, there's no real reason these two cities could not coexist, but free worship without proper counsel comes at a cost. The Dunmer and the Khajiit, who I've mentioned already, are good examples of cultures that understand this cost. The Cats are open about their love for moon sugar, but they also warn against the dangers of over-sweetening one's mind, losing oneself to the blood cat, straying from the moonward path to the sands behind the stars. And the Dunmer, in their pursuit of the Psijic endeavour, appreciate the testing gods of the troubled house. But appreciation for these corrupting spirits does not mean kneeling for them. The Ayleids, however, for all their grandeur, failed to properly warn against the insidious aspects of the demon lords. Thus did the elves of Abergalus fall prey to Molag Bal's jealousy, his insecurity, his obsessive desire to belittle and to dominate. So, when the king of Abergalus saw the Chapel of Light across the valley, he did not relish in the glory of his kin, but suffered a blow to his pride. He bade his warriors build a chapel to Molag Bal that was even greater. But a warrior's hands are made for ends, not beginnings, and though their creation was larger than the Chapel of Lights, it was crude, lackluster, and the Ayleids of Cyrodiil didn't even notice. This unconcern of the Cyrodiils ate a hole into the heart of the king of Abergalus, and he was vexed unto madness. He sent soldiers to profane the small shrine to Meridia in Abergalus, and then went to his vast shrine to Molag Bal, where he swore a mighty oath. And slaying a family of visiting Cyrodiils on the altar, the king vowed that he would gather his army, march across the valley, and capture all of the Cyrodiils, sacrificing them to Molag Bal within the Chapel of Lights. And the king of Abergalus mustered all of his soldiers, and on a night in which the skies were lit by a furious racing aurora, he marched them across the valley to Cyrodiil. But when the king and his army arrived, they found the land empty, for the city of Cyrodiil was gone unto every brick. And the king thought he heard laughter in the lights in the skies, mirth that turned to shrieks of fear that came, not from above, but from back across the valley. In haste, the king marched his soldiers back to his city, but when they arrived at Abergalus, they found it utterly destroyed as if by scorching light. And of the families of the soldiers and the king, nothing could be found but their shadows burnt into the walls of the city. Thus Abergalus. But of the fate of Cyrodiil, nothing more was known. This is one of the many tales of Meridia's ongoing relationship with Molag Bal, and there's more to this story than the legend suggests. The Ayleids of Abergalus had planned far more than merely sacking the city of Cyrodiil. They had plotted with Bal to sap the magic from Meridia's city, and turn all the inhabitants of Cyrodiil into undead slaves. To achieve this, Molag Bal gave King Umaril of Abergalus the Mortem Vivicus, which was essentially a vortex that fed off of souls. It wouldn't take a daedrologist to determine which Daedric prince created this weapon. In response, Meridia bestowed the people of Cyrodiil with the prismatic core, a shard of crystal that could counter the vortex's devastating power. Ultimately, Abigalis was razed to the ground, and King Umaril lost everything, but his story was not yet concluded. And what of Deledil? I mentioned the recorded legend titled The Withering of Deledil, but I must address what is lost in the translation from written to spoken mediums. Deledil did not wither as a flower withers. The withering in question is spelled with an additional H, as in the archaic wither, to be relocated, and there is evidence to suggest that Meridia transposed Deledil from Nirn to Molag Bal's realm of Coldharbour, where it would serve as her embassy to his domain. Now, if you've seen my video on Molag Bal, then you know my theory that Coldharbour is a realm of regret, that the Prince of Domination hoarded the salvaged remnants of an adjacent place that he ruled in another Kalpa's world river. That's why Coldharbour appears to be composed of tarnished mockeries of Tamrielic landmarks. But one of the plane's most prominent hubs is the Hollow City. This city is unique as it is protected from Bal's influence by none other than Meridia. Planes of Oblivion are extensions of their princes, yet Meridia is somehow able to infiltrate Bal's mind. If that's not a description of a lover, then I don't know what is. According to the groundskeeper of the Hollow City, who is in fact Meridia in disguise. Long ago, this city existed in Nirn. It was alive and vibrant and went by a different name. Its people were devoted to Prince Meridia, the Radiant One. They lived in peace and assumed themselves safe from any dangers. But Meridia has enemies, such as the despicable Molag Bal. The Prince of Murder sent minions from Coldharbour to destroy her beloved city. She proceeds to explain how the people prayed to Meridia for assistance, and she transported the city through the portal into Bal's realm. If the Hollow City is not Deledil, then it is most certainly another of the Ayleid cities devoted to the Lady of Light. As well as Molag Bal, there is also evidence of at least one Ayleid city devoted to the Prince of Destruction, Mehrunes Dagon. Of all the Daedra lords, Dagon is arguably the most unlikely of choices for Ayleids to worship, especially at the height of their power. Dagon is primarily concerned with revolution. He is a god of ambition, but not the constructive kind, rather the dismantling kind. For whatever we may come to say about the Ayleids later in this video, there is one virtue we cannot take from them, and that's their pursuit of greatness. They strove to build the tallest towers, the most enduring and beautiful cities, civilizations that shot for the stars by any means necessary. Dagon would have been more alluring to their slaves. Nevertheless, where there is power to be harnessed, the elves who plunge the caverns of lore in search of the gold of truth would harness it. There is no evidence of the Ayleids ever possessing the Mysterium Xarxes, though that artifact will come up later in the video. A Daedra lord's memoirs would be priceless, especially those of a lord known for setting empires to the torch. Another of his artifacts was known to the Ayleids, however, and that was Mehrunes' razor. An infamous artifact, yet its true potential is elusive to most mundane-minded mortals. More on that later. In the Heartland of Cyrodiil, during the height of Ayleid rule, Mehrunes Dagon set a trap. This trap was called the Nephara Vigum, and the bait was none other than the Prince's razor. Any who entered the Nephara Vigum would have to face Dagon's champion named Miseray Feifung. Miseray was once a Nord, before he failed Dagon. As punishment, the prince ordered his Dremora servants to tear open the champion's chest with the razor, turning him into something else entirely. Something undead and vengeful, sundered as his Nordic god Shor had been. Hoping to protect the Daedric site, the Ayleids constructed the ringed citadel of Vasa Balim around it, keeping challengers at bay. The Ayleids were never able to disarm the trap and obtain the razor, as the citadel was overrun by the foul curse of vampirism. It would seem that the Ayleids who built Vasa Balim were not fond of Molag Bal's blessings, as the Ayleids of Abigalis had been. Speaking of Bal, this brings us to the final prince that we can say with confidence at least some of the Ayleids worshipped. And I believe it is this prince, despite his usually amiable reputation, that is tied with Bal in setting in motion the downfall of the mighty Ayleid Empire. This prince was known as the Blood Made Pleasure, but you might be more familiar with his other name, Sanguine. I plan to discuss in a future Daedrology video just how sinister Sanguine's sphere is. We can talk about it until we're blue in the face. Even those deep in the throes of Sanguine's pleasure fits, marinating in maelstroms of unadulterated indulgence, would tell you that what they're engaged in is anything but healthy. These vices aren't as overt as domination or destruction, but as the Khajiit emphasise in their oral traditions, being bewitched by Sanguine's tantalising touch will always lure true cats from the twilit path. The silent priest Amandro writes, "These are the urges of blood and pleasure without purpose. To fall to Sanguine is not to give in to the dark, but to give in to the flesh. The secret to defeating him is to ignore him, and this we learned from Mephala, who said, 'Lust for nothing but truth.'" This would have been valuable advice for the Ayleids, who once prided themselves on the pursuit of truth, seeking it by starlight in the darkest recesses of Nirn. The Ayleid Empire was thriving, and with an abundance of slave labour all across the Heartland, the good citizens of Cyrodiil grew idle. And as the old adage goes, idle hands are the devil's playground. In his memoirs, Morahouse, a crucial character in the story to come, writes the following about the Nedic slave years under the Ayleids. Men were given over to the lifting of stones, and the draining of the fields, and the upkeep of temple and road, or to become art tortures for strange pleasures, as in the wailing wheels of Vindazel, and the gut gardens of Circen, and flesh sculpture, which was everywhere among the slaves of the Ayleids in those days, or worse, the realms of the Fire King Hardhall, where the begetting of drugs drawn from the admixture of Daedrons into living hosts let one inhale new visions of torment, and children were set aflame for nighttime tiger sport. Perhaps there had been a time, during the preliminary years of the Empire, that the Ayleids could have justified to themselves and their more humane Direnni kin that the enslavement of the tribal, primal needs was for the greater good. Perhaps they believed that every human life thrown at the marble walls of their sublime architectural achievements brought mortal kind closer to the divine. Maybe they thought the needs could accept a life of subservience to be a part of something glorious, something that transcended their simple, unsophisticated culture. But these flimsy justifications were severed when the Ayleids embraced the spheres of princes like Sanguine and Molag Bal, when the slaves became entertainment to them. Just as an aside, I called the Direnni more humane, but they don't stand on strong ground when it comes to altruism. They might not have committed gruesome acts upon the needs as the Ayleids did, but humans were sources of entertainment in both civilizations. The Direnni showed little respect for the needs, and treated them more like playthings. According to another of Thrastus of Elenhir's texts, one titled Bretons, Mongrels or Paragons, he writes, "In contrast to the Ayleids of Cyrodiil, who brutally enslaved any humans they came into contact with, the Direnni simply conquered their local needs and then ruled them as a caste of nobility. The aristocratic elves established a system of feudal vassalage over their human subjects, with rights and privileges that included the perquisite of coition with any human they desired. Sex with attractive needs was considered casual recreation, and Direnni nobles competed to have stables of the most desirable human subjects. I'm sure many needs would argue that being treated as a sex slave is just another form of torture. But, as callous as it may be to point out, when you're in the elite class, subjugating those below you is a delicate affair. Any populist political figure would tell you as much. You can hold people down and take advantage of them, but you mustn't take it too far. Provide reassurances, offer glimmers of hope. Never let the inequalities become glaringly obvious. And most important of all, optics are everything. So while the Direnni aristocracy might have taken needs and half-elves as a sexual commodity, the horrid deeds took place behind closed doors. So the victims were at least spared the public form of humiliation. And as Thrastus goes on to say, offspring from these liaisons were not adopted into the families of their Direnni parents, being considered sub-mer, but were nonetheless often given privileged positions among the subject needs. So, the Direnni Elves ease the pain of complete subjugation by giving their victims elevated status in society. It's a brilliantly conniving scheme. The Ayleids, on the other hand, grew complacent. Their hubris instilled within them a sense of invincibility. They openly tortured their slaves and revelled in it. They didn't even try to keep it a secret, allowing revulsion and resentment to fester among their subjects. Combine this with the fact that humans are more abundant, that they procreate more than elves, and unrest within the Heartland was bound to boil over. It really is difficult to understand what led some Ayleids to take such pleasure in the macabre. Even if they consider non-elves to be beneath them, it takes a big push to make people relish in death and suffering. It really shows just how quickly mortals can disregard empathy when they start perceiving others as others. It reveals the tribal nature of mortals, a tribal nature that I'm sure the Ayleids would claim they had outgrown long ago. It's also possible that an elf who believes wholeheartedly that mortality is a trap, that Lorkhan cursed them to gradually diminish from god to mer, would find morbid fascination in the frailty of the mortal form. That could explain why the flesh sculptors used the splayed corpses of slaves as their canvases, and entrails as their props. But the depravity of it is so hard to swallow that the slaves must have concluded that to die in revolt was infinitely more honourable than dying gruesomely to laughter and applause. One text, titled Masterwork of the Inducer, details art torture and flesh sculpture in all its glory through the eyes of Eldhal the Inducer. The text is translated from the artist's own account, though much of it is unreadable. It says, "It was a subject yearning for ascent to the ultimate purpose of its form. A vision of the shape and the method took me immediately, and I stilled the form. I stopped its sight and speech and stood it in the working space. I ordered the servants to stay and bear witness to a perfect example, and began the dedication rituals. And to it I sang and hummed and whispered. The cage of its heart gave assent and unfurled with no splintering, no cracking, the life's rhythm persisting. I ordered fine silver chains. Into each link I inscribed the 100 words for bliss, and I wrapped the cage and trunk all round to best display the organ at work. Such joy! It must have been that blood-made pleasure watched the work, guided my movements. A new inspiration came upon me, and fervidly I grasped the sight orbs between the implements. I blessed it with wings of welkind, gently grafted and obtained at great expense. I extended its blood paths, a delicate web within shining light. 8 stars for its crown, 8 rubies at its feet, splayed forearms reaching for Aetherius. It became real when I gave it the name, Messenger Beast Redeemed. And so we see a direct reference to blood-made pleasure, to Sanguine himself. And it seems Eldhal was enthralled by the marvels of the mortal form. The way the heart beats in imitation of the missing god, the way the ribs protect the heart like the earth bones protect Nirn, the way the fingers and sight orbs are drawn instinctively up as they die, jutting skyward like antennas to Aetherius, as if some greater power calls to them and sends signals down their digits. A dark, troubling part of my soul resonates with the Inducer's artistic obsession, but the rest of me cries out with empathy. My time among the Telvanni has taught me much about the precarious line between discovery and brutality. The Roman poet Ovid wrote the following in his narrative titled Metamorphoses, translated by Henry T. Riley. Daedalus said to his son, "Icarus, I recommend thee to keep the middle tract, lest, if thou shouldst go too low, the water should clog thy wings. If too high, the fire of the sun should scorch them." At the same time, he delivered him rules for flying, and fitted the untried wings to his shoulders. Amid his work and his admonitions, the cheeks of the old man were wet, and the hands of the father trembled. He gives kisses to his son, never again to be repeated. And, raised upon his wings, he flies before, and is concerned for his companion, just as the bird which has led forth her tender young from the lofty nest into the air. And he encourages him to follow, and instructs him in the fatal art, and both moves his own wings himself, and looks back on those of his son. A person while he's angling for fish with his quivering rod, or the shepherd leaning on his crook, or the ploughman on the plough-tail, when he beholds them, is astonished, and believes them to be divinities, who thus can cleave the air. The boy began to be pleased with a bolder flight, and forsook his guide, and touched with a desire of reaching heaven, pursued his course still higher. The vicinity of the scorching sun softened the fragrant wax that fastened his wings. The wax was melted. He shook his naked arms, and wanting his oar-like wings, he caught no more air. His face, too, as he called on the name of his father, was received in the azure water, which received its name from him. To cleave the air with crook, rod or wing, to command it, divide it, and harness it. The elements are divine forces, so mastery over them surely brought mortals closer to heaven. Such an intoxicating prospect sent Icarus plummeting into Poseidon's depths, and bereaved Daedalus. The Ayleids might not have flown as high as the birdmen, but they harnessed the elements of air and sunlight, and they yearned for more law and magic on slave-made pinions that crumpled under the weight of ruthless repression. The first sign of overindulgence came with the Ayleid Exodus. In the late Malefic, early First Eras, one subset of the Ayleids, known as the Ayleid Ayleids, resisted the spread of Daedra worship across Cyrodiil. This enduring conflict was called the Narfinsal Schism, and was brought to an end in First Era 198, when the Daedrophile Ayleids of Atatar drove the Ayleids of Wendelbeck out of the Heartland. The Ayleids were forced to adapt to the nigh inhospitable Mayas of Argonia. However, despite the fact that the Ayleids venerated the Aedra, they were just as prone to sadism as their Cyrodiilic counterparts. They quickly came into conflict with the native Argonians of Black Marsh, as well as Nedic tribes like the Kofringi. There's even evidence that they participated in flesh sculpture as well. Alas, the sadism festering in the Ayleid Empire eventually caused a reaction. The Needs could only tolerate so much, and sedition stirred. Standing up to the Ayleids alone would have been a death sentence, and collectivization wasn't exactly easy to achieve in the slave pens scattered across the Ayleid Empire. Even if the slaves outnumbered the slavers, it would take divine intervention, and it just so happened that divine intervention was granted by the god of the elves. Or was it the god of men? That's a distinction we can save for later. South of Lake Rumer, in the city of Sardavar-Lead, a slave named Alesh, Aleshat, Esha, Alessia, Paraval, Pavesh, Perifu, Perif, perhaps even Paravania, cast her hands towards the heavens, and beseeched the gods for deliverance from their elven jailers. From the Song of Pelinal, Volume 2. And then Perif spoke to the handmaiden again, eyes to the heavens which had not known kindness since the beginning of elven rule. And she spoke as a mortal, whose kindle is beloved by the gods for its strength in weakness, a humility that can burn with metaphor, and yet break easily and always doomed to end in death. And this is why those who let their souls burn anyway are beloved of the dragon and his kin. And she said, "And this thing I have thought of, I have named it, and I call it freedom, which I think is just another word for Shazar who goes missing. You made the first rain at his sundering, and that is what I ask now for our alien masters, that we might sunder them fully and repay their cruelty by dispersing them to drown in the Topal. In order to properly unravel the cryptic words of these fragmentary texts in full, I ought to direct you to my video on Pelinal. I'll leave a link to it below. But in the interest of full, elaborate disclosure, which I feel is needed to understand the downfall of the Ayleid Empire, let me expand on some of this. Alesia was born a slave. She grew up a slave. Her understanding of the cosmos and of the gods was therefore a confusion of elven and Nedic spirituality. It's hard to say which gods the Needs of the Heartland worshipped prior to the arrival of the Ayleids. Other subsets, like the Dothraki Needs of the West, left traces of their religion, but the Ayleids were effective in wiping out any culture the Heartland Needs had established. In the century leading up to Alessia's birth, the Nords had reclaimed, or taken, the northern reaches from the Snow Elves, canonising their totemic pantheon as the official religion of Skyrim. News of this had certainly reached the slaves. Perhaps it even inspired them. Whatever the case, it's safe to say that Alessia was fumbling around in the dark when trying to commune with the gods. The Song of Pelinal was assembled from various old fragmentary texts, and as a result, it's seen as somewhat of an authority when it comes to what happened in the Alessian Rebellion. At no point does the song specify who Perif spoke to. That is our conclusion to draw. Contemporary texts, like the Trials of Saint Alessia and the Amulet of Kings, confidently assert that it was Akatosh who answered her prayers. We'll reference those texts later, but Akatosh as we understand him from an Imperial perspective did not exist at this point in time. In hindsight, as we'll discuss in detail, it makes sense for Imperial texts regarding Alessia to refer to the gods by their Alessian names, but these names can be misleading on the surface. I believe Alessia was communicating with the Nordic gods. Shor is the chief of the Nordic pantheon. He is their interpretation of Lorkhan. In the Dawn Era, Lorkhan and the Wandering Elnefey, the precursors to the races of man, clashed with Auriel and the Old Elnefey, the precursors to the races of Mer. In my most recent video on the Prince of Madness, Sheogorath, I asserted that Shor Lorkhan is the god of all mortals, for he gifts them with his divine spark upon death. He sacrifices himself for all the children of Mundus. But the elves shunned this gift, and instead saw what Lorkhan created as a trap. Therefore, they followed Auriel into battle against the trickster god. To the Oldmer, therefore, Lorkhan was the spirit of man, a Padamaic force, a rival to their Anuic spirit, Auriel. Auriel and Akatosh are often considered to be different names for the same entity. Auriel roughly translates to golden star, while Akatosh is depicted as a golden dragon. But as will become glaringly obvious in the retelling of this chapter in history, names don't tell the full story. The gods at play in Alessia's prayers are the following: Akatosh, Shazar, Mara and Kain. It is not impossible that Auriel might have looked upon the Ayleid Elves with disdain. Despite their magnificent empire and their subjugation of inferior humans, they had turned to the worship of Padamaic spirits, to the Daedra lords. But it soon becomes clear through Alessia's prayers and the miracles that are bestowed to her that this is the divine intervention of Shor Lorkhan, not Auriel. And doesn't that make perfect sense? For the spirit of man to liberate the human slaves from elven oppression. To start, who is the handmaiden? Well, in Nordic belief, as stated in Varieties of Faith the Nords, Mara is a handmaiden of Kain and the concubine of Shor. The Song of Pelinal could easily have referred to Mara by a better known title, like the Goddess of Love or Mother Mara, but no, it used the Nordic descriptor, handmaiden. On top of that, Kain is a Nordic goddess, and is not included in the Old Meri pantheon, yet she is crucial in answering Alessia's prayers. Varieties of Faith the Nords refers to her as the widow of Shor. Mara speaks with Alessia on behalf of the two gods at the pinnacle of the Nordic pantheon, Kain and Shor. In her prayers, Perif has an epiphany. She imagined the concept of freedom, what some would call Numantia, and she realised it was part of Lorkhan's sphere, not Auriel's. She calls him Shazar, the Alessian imperialised name for Lorkhan. She implores Kain, the widow of Shor, to mourn the enslavement of Shor's human children with the same intensity that she mourned her husband when he was slain by Auriel. First, Kain sends unto Alessia her son, the demigod man-bull Morahouse. But it was her second blessing that truly rained poetic justice down upon the Ayleids. And this rain was the blood of Shor, a downpour that would erode an empire. Song of Pelinal, Volume 2, On His Coming. Kain granted Perif another symbol, a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves, whose facets could unsector and form into a man whose every angle could cut her jailers. And a name, Pelinal, which is the star-made night, and he was arrayed in armour from the future time. If you'd like to hear my detailed retelling of this legend, the Ballad of Pelinal, remember to check the link in the description below. But it would appear that the very stone the Ayleids had found in one of their wells, that they had cut down into the diamond-shaped Kim-El Adabal, that they used as the founding stone for their Tower of White Gold, would be their undoing. Kim-El Adabal. Roughly translated from Elnifex, we have Kim, meaning royalty, starlight, high splendour, El, meaning soul or star, Ada, meaning spirit or god, and Baal, meaning stone. You can arrange these loose definitions to form a name that is pleasing to you, but in essence, the Kim-El Adabal is the godstone of high royalty, and the Ayleids knew it possessed far more power than a typical shard of meteoric glass. The prime deity of the Aldmeri pantheon had inadvertently given this relic to the Elves of Cyrodiil when he fired Lorkhan's heart across Tamriel, the Starry Heart, in the words of the monomyth. But when Trinimac and Auriel tried to destroy the heart of Lorkhan, it laughed at them. It said, "This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other." So Auriel fastened the thing to an arrow and let it fly long into the sea, where no aspect of the new world may ever find it. Auriel was naive to think no aspect of the new world would find the heart, for it would soon drive a wedge between the elves of the east, and Lorkhan would have the last laugh, as a single drop of his divine blood would topple the loftiest elven empire. Pelinal walked into the jungles of Cyrodiil already killing, Morahouse stamping at his side, froth-bloody and bellowing from excitement, because the Pelinal was come. And Pelinal came to Perif's camp of rebels holding a sword and mace, both encrusted with the smashed viscera of elven faces, feathers and magic beads, which were the markings of the Ayleids, stuck to the redness that hung from his weapons, and he lifted them saying, these were their eastern chieftains, no longer full of their talking. The malefic era of the elves was at an end. Doom had come to the Heartland. With the promise of 2 Arda, Morahouse and Pelinal, Perif finally mustered the numbers and the courage to spark the Alessian Rebellion. Little did she know at the time, the wrath of the White Strake was to be a whirlwind of death and destruction. As a man fashioned from stone, Pelinal was sometimes too rigid for reasoning. He was unsected and reformed to cut the elven jailers, and sometimes this meant the cutting of all elves, even their most distant relatives. According to the Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition, Pelinal Whitestrake, Nibene warlord of the Elven Pogrom, mistook the Khajiit for another strain of Aldmeri, and killed many of their number before realising his error. But this was a time of revolution, and the Nedic slaves emerging from their subterranean cells into the heart of an adversarial empire needed power over precision. Nevertheless, Pelinal was wise enough to see the weakness shared by all of the most tyrannical Ayleid kings, their hubris and their pride, and so he preyed upon them. Volume 3, On His Enemy. Pelinal Whitestrake was the enemy of all elf-kind that lived in Cyrodiil in those days. Mainly though, he took it upon himself to slay the sorcerer kings of the Ayleids in pre-arranged open combats, rather than at war. The fields of the rebellion he left to the growing armies of the Paravania and his bull nephew. Pelinal called out Haramir of Copper and Tea into a duel at the Tor, and ate his neck veins while screaming praise to Riemann, a name that no one knew yet. Gordhauer the Shaper's head was smashed upon the goat-faced altar of Ninandava, and in his wisdom Pelinal said a small plague spell to keep that evil from reforming by Welkind magic. Later that season, Pelinal slew Hadhul on the granite steps of Seatar, the Fire King's spears knowing their first refute. For a time, no weapon of the Ayleids could pierce his armour, which Pelinal admitted was unlike any crafted by men, but would say no more even when pressed. When Huna, whom Pelinal raised from grainslave to hoplite and loved well, took death from an arrowhead made from the beak of Selafell the Singer, the Whitestrake went on his first madness. He wrought destruction from Narlame all the way to Cyrodiil, and erased those lands from the maps of elves and men, and all things in them, and Perif was forced to make sacrifice to the gods to keep them from leaving the world in their disgust. One by one, the sorcerer kings fell, One faceless man, shrouded in steel, butchered the most exalted of the Ayleids. This race had locked their eyes on the stars above. They were so focused on ascension that they were oblivious as their legs were swept out from under them. Pelinal intentionally delivered the grisliest deaths upon the cruelest kings, humbling them, debasing them. They were lambs running on shaky limbs from the slaughter. For a time, every Ayleid sorcerer king was afraid of his own shadow, fearing that a gleaming red diamond would materialize behind him. Doubtless, each and every one of those rulers would have measured the weight of their cruelty and debauchery over the years, wondering if their sins against the spirit of man were going to be repaid in blood. Were it not for their faith in the most radiant Meridia, the Ayleids might just have surrendered to the White Strake then. And then came the storming of White Gold, where the Ayleids had made pact with the Aurorans of Meridia, and summoned them, and appointed the terrible and golden-hued half-elf Umaril the Unfeathered as their champion. And, for the first time since his coming, it was Pelinal who was called out to battle by another, for Umaril had the blood of the Arda, and would never know death. Arda against Arda, Godspawn against Godspawn. Umaril was the sorcerer king of City Isle, and sat the throne at the heart of Cyrodiil, beneath the Temple of the Ancestors, the Tower of White Gold, where the masses called him the Dread Castellan. He was also Meridia's champion, and looked just like her Daedric Aurorans, bending the magics of colour and hue, manipulating spectra until they became knights of killing light. In many ways then, Umaril was like Pelinal, but who or what was he? Behind the triune of Alessian Mora and Pelinal, the Cattle Queen, the Winged Bull and the Killing Light, the Daedric rebels drove into the heart of the Heartland. Pelinal drove the sorcerer armies past the Niben, claiming all the eastern lands for the rebellion of the Paravania. And Cain had sent her rain to wash the blood from the villages and forts that no longer flew Ayleid banners, for the armies of men needed to make camps of them as they went forward. And he broke the doors open for the prisoners of the Vartak, with the slave queen flying on Mora House above them, and men called her Alesh for the first time. He entered the gate to win back the hands of the 1,000 strong of Cyrodiil, a tribe now unknown but famous in those days, which the Ayleids had stolen in the night, 2,000 hands that he brought back in a wagon made of demon bone, whose wheels trailed the sound of women when ill at heart. And after the first pogrom, which consolidated the northern holdings for the men of Crete, he stood with white hair gone brown with elf blood at the bridge of Helden, where Pereth's falconers had sent for the Nords, and they, looking at him, said that Shor had returned, but he spat at their feet for profaning that name. He led them anyway into the heart of the hinterland west, to drive the Ayleids inward, towards the Tower of White Gold, a slow retreating circle that could not understand the power of man's sudden liberty, and what fury idea that brought. The rebellion spread like a pox across Umaril's empire, and though he could see it all from his perch atop Tower 1, there was little he could do. He called upon the Merid coruscation, and channeled her scintillations into mighty thundernarks that harried the Elysians on their march. But Pelinal's mace smote those infernal golems before they could trouble Alessia's host, and he scoffed at these things that crawled out of Oblivion's waters, and dared to trespass in Shor's domain. And when the Unfeathered one instead opted for more mundane methods, the volleys of birdbeaks from the finest Ayleid archers, the Elysians pressed on still, until they came to the shores of Lake Remare. Insurrection had stirred into a hurricane, and the Needs had hardly noticed what they'd been swept up into, until they were upon the doorstep of their greatest foe. So disconcerting was the sight of the White Gold Tower, in all its architectural glory, that trepidation seized the ranks of Paravania's armies, and the Nords who had been so willing to fight behind the avatar of their chief god suddenly felt the need for caution, and this delay infuriated Pelinal, who was close to another bout of madness. Pelinal did all he could to manage his nature, but ultimately his consciousness was filled with the echoes of myths beyond the mundane. He was a fragment of Shor Lorkhan, a descendant of Sithis, the progeny of the Padamaic. He tried to ignore the consequence of his nature, to dismiss talk of god logic, to enact rather than talk, as language without exertion is dead witness. But in the throes of madness, he could not hide from what he was beneath those plates of steel. He blamed his murderous ways on Akka, and his madnesses which went on until the gods touched his cheek and soothed his ire. One Need, named Garrod, who was of the men of Gi, once asked Pelinal what his affliction felt like, to which Pelinal could only answer, like when the dream no longer needs its dreamer. I will not comment on the concepts of Amaranth and the Godhead in this video, though I implore you to do your own research if your curiosity cannot be sated by what I say next. But whether you believe he is a dead god or the Daedric Prince of Mundus, there is no denying that the mortal realm is Lorkhan's world child, his dream made manifest. And in my estimation, when Pelinal experiences his madnesses, he experiences the dream living on after the death of its dreamer. And I mention all of this because, like Pelinal Whitestrake, Umaril the Unfeathered is burdened with the mantle of demigodhood. But as I said, who or what is he? When Pelinal's impatience prevails, we see through his narrow-slitted helm just what Umaril is. The half-elf showed himself bathed in meridian light, and he listed his bloodline in the Ayleid Dune and spoke of his father, a god of the previous Kalpa's world river. Time passes, and like the tales of Icarus and Ramesses II, the weight of every word in song and history increases. Umaril listed his bloodline, a lineage we will never be able to trace, but he betrays a crucial detail. His father was a god of the previous Kalpa's world river. On its surface, this says little. Water is associated with memory after all. But like archaeologists brushing the contours of oral tradition, we can glean some meaning from these words. If you're familiar with my previous delvings into the nature of the Orbis, you've probably heard me explain what a Kalpa is already. Or if you're at all familiar with Hindu spirituality, you don't need me explaining it to you at all. But for anyone unsure, a Kalpa is a cycle of time and creation, spanning from the Dawn Era to the destruction of the world. The Ouroboros, Satakal the World Serpent, eating its tail in an infinite circle of birth and death. To hail from another Kalpa means to hail from another instance of creation. Beyond our meta-understanding of Kalpas, mortals understand very little about this concept. Perhaps the strongest example we have comes from the adjacent place of Lig, which is described as a parallel version of Tamriel. From Mehrunes Dagon the Liberator, via Mankar Cameron's Mythic Dawn commentaries, we learn about a realm ruled by the tyrant Dread Kings. According to the 36 Lessons of Vivek, when the Dregs ruled the world, the Daedric Prince Molag Bal had been their chief. He took a different shape then, spiny and armoured and made for the sea. These dregs enslaved the inhabitants of the 19 and 9 and 9 oceans until the slaves finally invoked Dagon and achieved Numantia, which is freedom. Lig was unmade and the Kalpa was ended. So when Umaril says his father was a god of the previous Kalpa's world river, it's hard not to think of Molag Bal. But why would the son of Molag Bal serve as the champion of Meridia? Surely that would only happen if Molag Bal had been Meridia's lover. And while we know that Molag Bal and Meridia have clashed plenty of times throughout history, there is evidence to suggest that they were allies too, and perhaps even mates. And I don't mean mate in the Australian way. The Khajiiti silent priest Amundro writes, "This demon, Molag, was the first to assault the lattice with intent, alongside Dagon and Meridnunda. So, at least in one pantheon, these Daedra lords work together. And according to the Imperial census of Daedra lords, Meridia was cast from the heavens for consorting with illicit spectra. I believe this illicit colour was a shade of blue, Molag Bal blue to be precise. I believe that after laying with the Prince of Domination, Meridia bestowed a mortal Ayleid with his seed. With Molag Bal's blood coursing through his veins, Umaril was the perfect Mer to tyrannize the Needs, and to avenge the liberation of Lig. One thing is for sure, so long as the Unfeathered One breathed, no man would be free. If Umaril could not crush the mind parasite that is Numantia, no one could. Perhaps the greatest tragedy for history's lovers is the fact that all records of Pelinal's clash with Umaril were lost to time. But the Song of Pelinal picks up immediately after its victor was decided. Umaril was laid low, the angel face of his helm dented into an ugliness which made Pelinal laugh, and his unfeathered wings broken off with sword strokes delivered, while Pelinal stood frothing above him, insulting his ancestry and anyone else that took ship from old Elnefey. The battered visage of Umaril was the symbol of the Ayleid Empire's demise. The violence would continue for some time, but the end was nigh. Pelinal's insults roused the remaining elvish kings who, despite their cowardice, finally felt that their meagre supply of honour had been breached. They were driven to a madness of their own, and they fell on him, speaking to their weapons, cutting the Pelinal into eighths. But they ran when Mor shook the whole of the tower with mighty bashing from his horns the next morning, and some were slain in overabundance in the taking. And men looked for more Ayleids to kill, but Pelinal had left none, save those kings and demons that had already begun to flee. The Ayleid Empire was no more. It was now time for an empire of men, led by none other than the slave queen Alesia. The Ayleids were not entirely dethroned though. According to one text, titled The Last King of the Ayleids, it appears that she had at least as much help from rebel Ayleid lords during the siege of White Gold Tower. Those Ayleid kings who defected to Alesia's side were not killed or driven out of Cyrodiil, but instead allowed to rule as lords of their former kingdoms and vassals to the Empress. Following the taking of White Gold in First Era 243, the remnants of Ayleid civilization entered the so-called Late Ayleid period, lasting around another 2.5 centuries. Alesia was posed with a unique conundrum in the wake of her ascension. The Nords had helped immensely in vanquishing the Ayleids, and they would have preferred Alesia's new Imperial people to worship their totemic animal gods. But as the text, Shazar and the Divine states, Alesia's subjects were as yet unwilling to renounce their worship of the Elven pantheon. She found herself in a very sensitive political situation. She needed to keep the Nords as her allies, but they were, at that time, fiercely opposed to any adoration of elven deities. On the other hand, she could not force her subjects to revert to the Nordic pantheon, for fear of another revolution. Therefore, concessions were made, and Empress Alesia instituted a new religion, the Eight Divines, an elegant, well-researched synthesis of both pantheons, Nordic and Aldmeri. Most of these gods could coexist in one consolidated pantheon, but there were two troublesome spirits, both of whom were the chief of their respective religions. Auriel was the king of the Aldmer, and his statues loomed over many of the citadels that had enslaved the Needs. For many men, the spread-eagle wings of Auriel would have been their last sight as they left the sunlit surface behind and entered the subterranean Ayleid expanses. There was also Shaw, Auriel's ancient antagonist. The text continues. Shazar, as a result, had to change. He could no longer be the bloodthirsty anti-Aldmer warlord of old. He could not disappear altogether either, or the Nords would have withdrawn their support of her rule. In the end, he had become the spirit behind all human undertaking. Even though this was merely a thinly disguised, watered-down version of Shaw, it was good enough for the Nords. But this was no way to reward the god that had answered Alesia's prayers, and sent his own crystallized flesh and blood to emancipate the slaves. So, Alesia smuggled Shaw, along with Auriel, into one chief deity that could be accredited for the glory of the Alessian Empire, a chief deity that would offend neither elf nor man. Behold the two-headed Akatosh, one head a golden dragon, the other a man. So, some Ayleids were able to assimilate into Alesia's new empire, but even they soon came under fire. The last king goes on to say, this was an uneasy relationship from the beginning, and was not destined to last long. Resentment at the continued presence of Ayleid nobles within the empire was a contributing factor to the rise of the so-called Alessian Order founded by Maruk. The first victims of the Alessians were the Ayleids of Cyrodiil, In the early 300s, the surviving Ayleid communities in human-ruled areas were obliterated one by one, the refugees temporarily swelling the power of the remaining Ayleid lordships. Maruk and his dogmatic order soon held most of the Empire's power. The Ayleid lordships were abolished. Enforcement of this decree does not appear to have required much direct violence. It seems that by this point, the balance of power was so overwhelmingly against them, and their fate so long foreshadowed, that most of the remaining Ayleids simply left Cyrodiil, eventually being absorbed into the elven populations of Valenwood and High Rock. And this is where we come to the question, what did the Ayleid remnants do upon escaping the Alessians? They might have spent some time licking their wounds, but resentment must have been rife. When Ysgramor returned to Skyrim with his 500 Atmoran companions to avenge the Night of Tears, he could have focused his efforts on hunting down the culpable Falmer, or simply reclaiming Sarfall. But no, Ysgramor led them on a crusade across the north, eradicating every last snow elf they could find. We can scold the Nords for their barbarity all we like, but one thing we cannot deny is that Ysgramor left no song unfinished. A few Falmer could cling to life, but they would never again pose a threat to the new human masters of the North. Alesia, on the other hand, hoped to bring about a cosmopolitan new realm, one where all peoples could cohabitate, beneath the supreme power of the Emperor, of course. Her work would largely be undone by Maruk, and you can find more information on that in my video on the ape who ruled Cyrodiil. But simply put, allowing Ayleids to leave or be consolidated into her empire meant leaving traces of the civilization that enslaved her and her people. Some enemies of the state did not flee at all, but barred their doors and reinforced their gates against the Alessians. Such was the case in Bravil. I mentioned that the Ayleids were the chief progenitors of alteration magic, and in one story, titled Daughter of the Niben, we can see the ingenuity that was bred from necessity within the walls of Bravil. The Alessians besieged the city, and the Ayleids had no escape. How the Ayleids were able to survive such a long siege is debated by scholars to this day. All, however, grant the honour of the victory to one of the Empress Alessia's centurions, a man called Teo Brevilius Tassus, the man for whom the modern town is named. It was said he invaded the village no less than 4 times, after heavy resistance, but each time upon the morning dawning, all his soldiery within would be dead, murdered. By the time more Centuria had arrived, the fortified town was repopulated with Ayleids. After the second successful invasion, secret underground tunnels were found and filled in, but once again, come morning, the soldiers were again dead, and the citizens had returned. After the third successful siege, legions were posted outside of the town, watching the roads and riverways for signs of attacks, but no one came. The next morning, the bodies of the invading soldiers were thrown from the parapets of the town's walls. Teo Brevilius Tassus knew that the Ayleids must be hiding themselves somewhere in the town, waiting until nightfall, and then murdering the soldiers while they slept. The question was, where? After the 4th invasion, he himself led the soldiers in a thorough inspection of every corner, every shadow. Just as they were ready to give up, the great centurion noticed 2 curious things. High in the sheer walls of the town, beyond anyone's ability to climb, there were indentations, narrow platforms, and by the river just inside the town, he discovered a single footprint from someone clearly not wearing the Imperial boot. The Ayleids, it seemed, had taken 2 routes to hide themselves. Some had levitated up to the walls and hidden themselves high above, and others had slipped into the river, where they were able to breathe underwater. Just as the Psijics had pioneered mysticism and the Direnni conjuration, the Ayleids had been the forefathers of alteration. The Ayleids were rooted out, but their resistance deserves a place in this chronicle. The Ayleid refugees who travelled east did not fare well. These refugees hoped to find sanctuary among the Barsebic Ayleids, but after the Narfinsel schism, the Barsebics retained no love for their Heartland kin. The Ayleid king Glenferran sought aid from the Barsebics of Gideon, but the Barsebics refused. According to Chancellor Abner Farn, the Barsebics of course were on the Daedric side in the Ayleid civil conflict known as the Narfinsal Schism, and were driven out of Cyrodiil by the Daedra worshippers in the Scouring of Wendelbeck. As this took place only a half-century before Alicia's slave revolt, the humiliation of exile still stung for the Barsebics. When King Glenferrin of Atatar sent an envoy to Gideon to call for aid against the rebellious Needs, the Barsebic king, I'm afraid his name is lost to history, sent him back with a blunt refusal. In the west, not only did some Ayleids find asylum, but they were also given the opportunity to fight back against the Alessians. Maruk's disdain for elves would have endeared him to Pelinal, but unlike Pelinal, the Alessian Order, led by the Marakati Selectives, could not crush all opposition with the same degree of efficiency and finality, and the Ayleid diaspora might just have directly bolstered the rivals of the Alessian Empire. The last king of the Ayleids states, "Indeed, the rise of the Direnni hegemony may be linked to this exodus of Ayleids from Cyrodiil. The Alessian Empire had started strong, but after the death of Perith, the figurehead of the rebellion, the following emperors struggled to keep control. Cyrodiil did not have one unified human culture. The Nibonese peoples of the east and the centre were close to Alesia and her successors, but the Colovians of the west preferred to keep their own kingdoms. The Alessians therefore tried to pacify the west, and even ambitiously attempted to annex the neighbouring province of Hyrok. But this bold conquest was thwarted by the Direnni Elves at the Battle of Glenumbra Moors in First Era 482. What's significant about this battle is that one of the key figures involved was a former Ayleid king, the last of the Ayleid kings, one Loloriaran Dainar of Nenalata. King Dainar had been ousted by the Alessian Order, and had set up a new citadel on the shores of Lake Halcyon in Hyrok. In a surprising repeat of history, this city, named Bisnensal, succumbed to Daedra worship, and King Dainar was deposed by Mora worshippers. Dainar and his family eventually made their way to Isle Balfiera, the centre of Direnni power and site of the Adamantine Tower. Loloriaran Dainar was recognised as a brilliant military tactician, and aided the Direnni in their war with the Alessians. According to the text, Last King of the Ayleids, the Dirennis decisively defeated the Alessians in 482. Ultimately, this battle would prove more disastrous for the Direnni, whose population was far smaller. The Pocket Guide 1st edition adds, although the Alessians were crushed at the Battle of Glenumbra Moors, this costly victory so weakened Old Merry power that the elves could no longer challenge the emerging nobility of Greater Brittany, who seized power throughout most of Hyrok within 2 decades of the Alessian defeat. Loloriaran Dainar's military might delivered a blow to the Alessians, a blow that must have been cathartic, but it would not be enough to avenge the upheaval of his ancestral empire. What about the Ayleids who fled south? According to the Pocket Guide to the Empire 3rd edition, in the forests, after all, diversity was the law, and the Bosmer welcomed escaped slaves from the Ayleids, and then Ayleids fleeing the Alessian Rebellion. Unlike in Blackmarsh and Hyrok, where Ayleid influence seemed to fizzle out, the southern refugees are harder to account for. Some refugees we know, like Umaril and the Ayleids of Abigalis, but others might have been absorbed into the Cameron dynasty of Valenwood, or even trekked further to settle among the Ultima of Summerset. More on those Ayleids soon. But as the text Ayleid survivors in Valenwood states, most successful, and they were more than a few, were the clans that fled southwest beneath the canopy of Valenwood. The clans of Anatwil, Vilverin, Talwink, Bourne, and Verondo all escaped largely intact to carve out a new life under the trees. These clans all worshipped Daedric Princes, but they seem to have done so with less fervour after their enforced migration to Valenwood, possibly due to the fact that the princes, when called upon, had offered little or no help to the forsaken clans. Fortunately, their new hosts, the Bosmer, were remarkably generous in welcoming the Ayleids into their realm, so long as the Heartland Elves agreed to adopt aspects of the Green Pact and refrain from harming the forest. For many of the Ayleids, this assimilation into Bosmeri culture diluted their own, but others, like Umaril, were staunch in their beliefs and unwilling to part with their ambitions. Archmage Umaril. Streaks of aurora had lit the way across the valley like a vivid clairvoyant spell cast by the ancestors. But when the amassed army of Abigalis crested the slope, Meridia's city was nowhere to be seen. The softly swaying grass was all that moved where the city had been. Cyrodiil had disappeared. Whither it went, Umaril could not say. The king crooked his neck and heard the laughter and the lights in the skies. When he marched his Mer back to Abigalis, he discovered the desolation caused by Meridia's radiance. Scorch marks marred the earth where the city had moments before stood. The omnicolour smears of aurora had not been guiding them after all. Rather, they were vivid trails of total annihilation. Their architecture had been razed to the ground, and every soul dwelling within and without had been turned to ash. The families of King Umaril and all the soldiers had been instantly incinerated. Their cowering, helpless shadows were burned into the rubble. They must have seen their doom as it descended upon them. Umaril, resplendent king of Abigalis, who had once reigned as Archmage from the White Gold Tower, was brought to his knees. The story of Cyrodiil on Mundus had ended there, but Umaril and the army of Abigalis, regardless of their affiliations with Molag Bal, were haunted by the mangled ghosts of innocent wives and children. So when the slave queen rose up to tear down the empire of the Ayleids, Umaril would not kneel. Anu Umaril, Umaril Anu. Eightfold would be his vengeance, one for every piece he and the other elvish kings had cut Pelinal into. One for every tower of creation, even the time-bending brass one that hadn't been constructed yet. Umaril's dreams were bent and golden-hued, as if they were reflected from the nose-hoop of the beast that led the Alessian reinforcements. He recalled the battle beneath the Temple of the Ancestors, and he wept until the dreams were warped and saturated and blue-hued. He had turned his featherless tail to the wind and flown when Mor shook the whole of the tower with mighty bashing from his horns. Alessian historians would slander his people for time undying, but Umaril cared not. He had made flight because he knew vengeance could not be swift. Men had no notion of patience. How could a creature that lives less than a century understand such a notion? No, the Alessians could have their celebrations. Entropy came to the Atada, and it would come to the descendants of Lorkhan. Umaril recalled the laughter in the lights in the skies, and he knew that the races of Mer would have the last laugh. Beradolmo the Signifier, in his persistent documentation of Ayleid lore, translated an Ayleid tract on the remnant of light. In that minute or eon of blood, Umaril brought Lord Felestis the remnant of light, Autoraku Alata, and begged him to take it to the cold sunset limit, Falsorn Glath, of Tamriel. Noble Felestis took the remnant, and with his clan or livestock, left Quirafil and travelled far. He kept the sunset always in his leftmost eye. Felestis was followed or pursued by the Ayleid emigrants. They came to a land of cold rocks and swam ashore, beached, berthed. The rocks were cold, hard, but the remnant of light made all fertile or wriggling. Many of the emigrants fell ill, but the light caused the rocks or mountains to bloom foodstone, colour under, which was tongue sweet and made healing. Felestis desired the remnant of light to smile, glow warm all of the cold rocks. So the emigrants, now strong with radiance, raised a mountain or pinnacle to affix it upon. This was collated in 880 minutes or eons. Then did all the cold rocks bloom foodstone, and every emigrant was healthy, impregnated, sharpened. After a long time, months wasted lying, noble Felestis was eaten by death, and in afterness the emigrants each cried a blue lake. But his helpmeet took him to the mountain or pinnacle, where was the remnant of light. Then Felestis was strong with radiance, and danced for 8 more choruses. Just as it was during the dance of the Selectives, time was hard to gauge. And just as Talos turned once jungled Cyrodiil into temperate grassland, Umaril had uncovered a relic capable of rewriting natural law. If the tract tells true, then Umaril had invented, found, or been bestowed with an artifact capable of making even the most desolate reaches of Tamriel fecund, and make the most destitute of souls whole. Sadly, the innovations of the Ayleid sorcerer kings are largely lost to time, and lost to an overabundance of man-centric historical records. But the existence of artifacts like the Remnant of Light make you wonder what else Ayleid civilization might have had before its downfall. Umaril's story, however, was not over, nor had his greatest scheme been revealed. In Orbic Enigma 4, Beradolmo writes, "As foretold by the Moth-eyed, Ayleid hubris was to bear bitter fruit. With their vision on high to behold the overworlds, they failed to note the seething needlings at their feet, until the thralls rose up and took their tower away from them. Kimel Adabal they took as well, but not before the Archmage Umaril fangled an eightfold staff of towers, each segment a semblance of a tower in its dance. Umaril, the cult of the ancestor moth, fate, and dragon dancing. Time was a casualty in this tale, so I'll not try to exactly date each of these events, but sometime before Pelinal and Morahouse came to deliver the White Gold Tower to Alesia, Archmage Umaril constructed his Staff of Towers. Beradolmo continues, and then 7 of the segments were borne by White Gold Knights to distant fold places, where they were hidden. With this added context, it's likely that the miraculous Remnant of Light was one of those 7 segments. Umaril went to great lengths to keep this staff out of human hands. As for the 8th segment, Umaril kept it close by. As an architect, he was inspired by the spikes of adamantia and white gold, which were the 2 most crucial spokes on the Orbic wheel, so he wore the last segment on one of his own Vitruvian spokes. Vitruvius, though he hailed from another iteration of the Godhead's dream, was an architect just like Umaril. In his book titled De Architectura, Vitruvius writes, "In a temple there ought to be harmony in the symmetrical relations of the different parts to the whole. In the human body, the central point is the navel. If a man is placed flat on his back, with his hands and feet extended, and a compass centered at his navel, his fingers and toes will touch the circumference of a circle thereby described. And just as the human body yields a circular outline, so too a square may be found from it. For if we measure the distance from the soles of the feet to the top of the head, and then apply that measure to the outstretched arms, the breadth will be found to be the same as the height, as in the case of a perfect square. Leonardo da Vinci took the Vitruvian man and gave him 4 arms and 4 legs, allowing him to strike 16 poses at once. In this shape, the man has 8 spokes adjoining the wheel encircling him, and his navel is the hub, the arena, the fragile depression in every being's torso that gives them life. Umaril kept 1/8 of his staff attached to 1/8 of his wheel, and walked south. As Umaril well knew, the Bosmer had their own Tower of Creation, a tower that resonated with Ifri's green songs from the dawn. The anonymously penned text on Jeffa reads, "When the elven folk walked to the land alone and sang songs of power amongst the trees and stars, Jeffa the singer walked with them. Jeffa gave heed to the nature of the forests and delighted in the gurgling streams and brooks. It was Jeffa who taught the birds to sing their songs of the seasons, and he that taught the streams the tinkling ethereal tune. The very trees are said to have moved close to hear him sing on the warm summer nights of those elder days. It was in this time that the first great ballads of the elves were made, crafted from the songs that Jeffa taught to the sylvan youth who frolicked to his lively tunes and ballads of nature in the unspoiled forest. Thus did the sylvan elves decide to grow a tower, rather than build it. It was called Green Sap. Its stone too was not a contrived thing, but a natural thing. It was a perchance acorn. Acorns are abundant in the forest, and each held meaning to the green people of Valenwood. Who was to say which perchance acorn was the definite one? All things that held the genetic blueprints to burgeon were equally magnificent. Umaril was a Mer of precision. Architects need to have mathematical minds that could turn randomness into geometry. In many respects, Ifri was an architect, taking the ooze of Bosmeri mythology and shaping it. Umaril admired this about the singer and his bucolic Bosma followers. As Ayleids were wont to do, Umaril crooked his neck and looked up, this time not at the stars, but at the hulking Gratwoods of Valenwood. In a strange green way, this was architecture of the archaic arboreal ilk. Ifri, or Jeffa as civilized elves called him, channeled his ambition into the trees, hence their vertical orientation, and their growth was nourished not by the calloused hands of mortals, but rather by the water of memory raining from above. Nevertheless, admiration for the Bosmeri way would not impede his intentions. Orbic Enigma continues. Now return we must to the 8th segment, or rather segment 1, for Umaril had fangled it in similitude to Tower 1, which itself reflected Tower 0. When the Ayleids fled the Heartlands, they went to all 8 corners of the compass, and this was a chosen thing, though many corners spelled doom. But more Ayleids fled to Valenwood than to all other directions combined, and this too was chosen. Among these clans went Umaril wearing segment 1 as a femur, for how but by walking can a spoke advance its hub? Greensap's elves welcomed the Ayleids so long as the Heartlanders agreed not to dissonate the Greensong. All agreed to this save Umaril, who coughed into his hand unnoticed. He asked the great Cameron to show him Greensap, and was brought to one that by happenstance stood then in Eldenroot. Once within the great Grat, he passed through a door equivocal and found his desire, the perchance acorn. It was one of many, but for Umaril, one was enough. Umaril capitalized on the ambiguity of Bosma spirituality. He was an unequivocal force, passing through equivocal doors, into equivocal grottoaks, to examine equivocal founding stones. This was the era of the Cameron King, whose hospitality was about to be exploited. Next, the fanglement. Umaril brought forth segment 1 among the roots and showed it to the golden nut, and this told an ending, so that the stone became a definite acorn. That elden tree would not walk again, but Umaril yet had further intentions for it. Using his dentition as tonal instruments, he dismantled his bones and built of them a mundus machine that mirrored Nirn and its planets. And when he had used all his substance in fangling this orrery, he placed the segment scepter within, hiding it between the moons. Archmage Umaril the architect made a tower of himself, with a staff at its apex, acting as a solar plexus as well as a solar system. Then he waited, but what he waited for did not eventuate, and perchance he's waiting yet, for Umaril had hoped to convert Greensap into white gold, and thereby make the Heartlanders' realm anew. However, Umaril did not know, and was not able to know, why his plan went awry. You see, Ayleid magic is about will and shall and must, but under Greensap, all is perchance. As I said some time ago, time was a casualty in this tale, not just in determining when this all occurred, but when, if ever, it came to an end. Like the Dwemer in the east, Umaril had been foiled by his adherence to order in the House of Sithis. Mundus is a realm with chaos in its genetics. This is why Magnus the architect had fled. This is why Auriel and his companions had wallowed as their power waned. What came of the Umarilian machine with its 8-spoke limbs is not known, but in the words of the legendary conjurer and daedrologist Morian Zenith. As for the osseous orrery, can anyone really claim to comprehend the full intentions of Umaril in his metamorphosis to instrumentality? Do we even know how many axes of circumpenetration its arms rotate through? Umaril was a part of Greensap now. His success, like his failure, cannot be calculated, and no amount of math or reason will change that. The Staff of Towers was later reassembled, and used by the Marakati Selectives to dance upon the White Gold Tower and break the dragon again. Umaril's creation, used to expunge the Aldmeri influences from Akatosh, leaving only Shor Lorkhan. The Ayleids had fled to the 8 corners of the compass, and though many of them spelled doom, many more remain a mystery. We know they were absorbed into Direnni-ruled High Rock, but where else might they have been assimilated? They must have gone north, and northeast. What if there were Ayleids with long memories lying dormant within other elven populations, plotting to destabilize the empires of men? One potential example of this can be seen in the Oblivion Crisis, when Mehrunes Dagon and the Mythic Dawn ended the Septim dynasty, and almost did to Tamriel what had been done to the adjacent place of Lig. Who exactly was Mankar Cameron, and why was he Oblivion bent on tearing down the Cyrodiilic Empire of Men? Beradolmo the Signifier claimed that more Ayleids fled to Valenwood than to all other directions combined. Mankar Cameron, despite his Ultima appearance, was supposedly born to Bosmer parents. The text titled The Refugees tells of a pregnant Bosmer named Carlis, who had been the mistress of Haemon Cameron, the Cameron usurper. In the throes of labour, she had screamed, "Mankar, he is coming, and he will bring death. He comes, and he will destroy all." No one saw his mother give birth, nor did any of them know she was with child at all. The birth seemed almost immaculate. This Mankar would go on to found the Order of the Mythic Dawn, and in his commentaries we can learn more about his so-called birth. Mankar Cameron was once like you, asleep, unwise, protonymic. We mortals leave the dreaming sleeve of birth the same, unmantled save for the symbiosis with our mothers, thus to practice and thus to reproachment, until finally we might through new eyes leave our halves, without need or fear that she remains behind. In this moment we destroy her forever, and enter the domain of Lord Dagon. My own summons came through a book Lord Dagon wrote himself in the deserts of rust and wounds. Its name is the Mysterium Xarxes, Old Muratada Aggregate, forefather to the wife of all enigma. Each word is razor-fed and secret, thinner than cataclysms, tarnished like red drink. Perchance his birth in Valenwood was only a rebirth. Roaring, I wandered until I grew hoarse with the gospel. I had read the mysteries of Lord Dagon, and feeling anew went mad with the overflow. Offering myself to that daybreak allowed the girdle of grace to contain me. When my voice returned, it spoke with another tongue. After 3 nights I could speak fire. This is the secret of how mortals become makers, and makers back to mortals. The bones of the wheel need their flesh, and that is mankind's heirloom. There is so much we could say about Mankar, but it is not his time yet. He speaks of proto and neonymics, old and new names. Mankar Cameron imbibed Dagon's red drink through the Mysterium Xarxes. He cut away his old flesh with Dagon's razor, and with those razor-fed word wounds, he had been reborn as a dragon and had taken a new name. This would explain why he appeared as an Ultima despite his Bosmeri parentage, and how he was able to become dragonborn and wear the Amulet of Kings. But perhaps his rebirth was only metaphorical, and he had always been a tan-skinned Ultima. There is a long-lost race of Ultima known for their tan skin after all. Combine this with his paradise looking like an Ayleid city, and his motives to tear down the Empire of Men and start anew. Is it possible that Mankar Cameron was a descendant of the Ayleids, wishing to avenge the fall of the Heartland Empire of Cyrodiil? If the Ayleids integrated into Valenwood, it's likely they went a little further too, back to their homeland of Alinor, the Summerset Isles. The High Elves of Summerset had always resisted the empires of men, even when the malefic era of the elves ended and human supremacy surfaced. The elves of Alinor were safe from subjugation. Being an island nation and having a formidable navy meant that no superpower would dare attempt an invasion. But Tiber Septim had acquired the portable Tower of Brass, and he had twisted the limbs of the Vitruvian man to point southwest. The siege of Alinor is as undocumented as it was disastrous. We may not know what exactly happened, but the Numidian brought the elves under Imperial control for the first time in history. If there was ever a place where disdain for human empires would boil over, it was going to be in the Summerset Isles. Cue the rise of the fringe Falmor party. The Falmor began in the First Old Merry Dominion as a sect of Alinor's government, devoted to safeguarding Old Merry heritage. Later, in the Second Old Merry Dominion, it became the governing body of Valenwood, bringing order to an overgrown province. However, in the wake of the Siege of Alinor and the chaos of the Oblivion Crisis, the Falmor resurfaced. The Ultima had endured a great deal at this point, and they were ready to be seduced by a nationalist political force. The Falmor-led Third Old Merry Dominion rallied its former allies and initiated the Great War, crippling the Cyrodiilic Empire. In response to Maruk's attempts to remove the Old Merry taint from Akatosh, the Falmor outlawed the worship of Talos in Cyrodiil and its vassal states. Whether that's a direct or indirect response, only you can decide. No longer would the spirit of man, the inspiration of Alesia, be revered. The preeminent question of the Elder Scrolls at this point in history is the following: what do the Falmor hope to achieve? I believe they aim to release the Old Elnafey and their Atada ancestors from the mundane trap. For more information on that scheme, I'll leave a link to my video on the Falmor secret plan in the description below. But there is evidence to suggest the Falmor are trying to unmake the mortal realm by deactivating the towers. Of the 8 towers, 3 have been destroyed or are missing their founding stones. Those 3 include Red Mountain, the Numidium, and the Orichalk Tower. 2 more towers are under Old Merry control, namely Crystal-like Lore and Greensap and Umaril. The next 2 have been somewhat subdued. These are the towers of Cyrodiil and Skyrim. Skyrim has been ravaged by civil war, while the Empire kneels before the Dominion. The one tower that exists outside of Falmor control is the most important one, Tower 0, Adamantia, the site of convention, the key to disarming the trap, and the inspiration of the Ayleids. When you consider the motives of the Old Merry Dominion, and the fact that their conquests seem to be converging upon the Towers of Creation, especially Tower 0, one must wonder, are the Ayleids involved? Of all the races on Nirn, who has the strongest adoration for the Towers of Creation? That would be the Ayleids, who constructed white gold in imitation of Adamantia. Of all the races on Nirn, who has the greatest aversion to mankind? That would be the Ayleids, who witnessed their glorious empire crumble beneath the bull's horns and the Crusader's blade. Tamriel has been ruled by men since the end of the Malefic, but the elves have long memories. Maybe the Ayleids will avenge their fallen empire. This dish, best served cold, may just be served 4,000 years later. Celestial bodies of bone rotate around the Umaril star, awaiting their eventual heat death. The unknowing descendants of a culture long gone succumb to a genetic memory, an urge to look up. They sense a lost connection with the stars, but the transmission is obscured by static. The stars are god tears into Ethereus, and mortals are made of stardust, of the magicka that seeps into dawn's beauty. They sense the presence of their dead ancestors, soaring skyward, wings combusting in the presence of the blinding divine. But every attempt to recall this glorious ancestry leads to dead ends, to paths with no end. The Ayleids sought immortality through architecture, and their cities still stand. But the green reclaims them with every rotation of the 8 planet limbs around Nirn. Their efforts are futile, for memory is as fluid as water, and water cannot be sculpted into cities and towers. Nothing else of the Ayleids remains. But time was a casualty in this tale, and as Umaril's rotational imprisonment beneath Greensap goes on and on without ending, and as certain sparkling spirits fade in and out of memory without closure, the story of the Ayleids cannot be concluded. And there you have it, guys, the ultimate guide to the Ayleids. No doubt more will be revealed along with the return of the Prince of Paths, Ophelia. But let's face it, these stories never truly end, do they? Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel for more Elder Scrolls deep dives, and if you'd like to support me while I embark on these arduous journeys, I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description below. but please only pledge if you can comfortably afford to. Thank you so much again for joining me. My name is Drew the Daedrologist. You've been watching Drew Mora, and I'll see you in the next one.